I'm Matt Tice with the Insurgent Mindset.
And I'm Rondo Moses. Hey, Matt.
Good to see you, Rondo. Looking forward
Likewise.
to today's episode where we're going to dig into electric vehicles. We haven't really touched this subject yet, and obviously the amount of change and backwards and forwards, and even the political overlay on this is incredibly interesting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Lots to talk about.
So, open us up with a brief primer on electric vehicles, maybe a little bit about the history and where we find ourselves today.
Yeah, I think when you think about this industry, I think it is a good case study in, insurgent behavior, innovation, and disruption. I think when most of us think about the EV industry, we think about Tesla. Tesla came on the scene in 2003, but as you reminded me a while ago, I mean, electric vehicles aren't new. But I think that Tesla actually made it, electric vehicles in the consumer's mind really feasible. And so the industry itself, I think, really took shape once Tesla came on the market with its Roadster, and then the Model S in 2012 is really when things really took off, and it really disrupted the automobile industry because now people were moving from combustibles to, or people were starting to move from combustibles to EV. So, Tesla has did a great job in terms of capturing the market of consumers who were really concerned about the environment and being more eco-friendly and sustainable conscious. And it took off and it started to really create a real challenge for the traditional incumbents in the automobile industry who were really stuck on, the combustible engine and really didn't take the EV market seriously until they recognized how disruptive this EV market was to their overall business, that there was an actual market out there of consumers who are really interested in about shifting from, the traditional combustible engine to more eco-friendly kinds of automobiles. And so Tesla has done a great job, but then, where we are now is that the market has allowed for new entrants to enter, and Tesla itself, over the past 5 years or so, has come up across some real challenges, relating to new model innovation, some production issues, et cetera, that opened the door for other EV startups to come in. And now I think we have a really dynamic market with several new insurgents that really have come in. And it makes you think whether Tesla is still an insurgent in the automobile industry or more of an incumbent in the EV space.
Very interesting. All right. If I might just add to the background a little bit, I think we have to remind ourselves, I think to your point that electric vehicle technology has been around for more than 100 years. Early in the age of automotive technology, it was vying for a position against the internal combustion engine, lost the battle, obviously. But fast forward 100, 125 years later, we've had over the last 2 decades a convergence of a number of things. And I think the convergence is really interesting to talk about just for a minute. In particular, you pointed out climate change playing a key role, something that wasn't really on the agenda, or at least not in the public mind until probably 2 decades ago. Certainly, the battery density has been driven largely by an adjacent industry, mostly consumer electronics, where that battery density, in the mid 90s when GM introduced the EV1, I think the range was maybe 30 or 40 miles, something like that. So
Mm.
completely, while a great concept, these cars were not really fit for purpose in that sense. So, 30, 40 years, 50 years of battery evolution till finally settling into high density lithium ion technology has made some of that possible. I think the other thing is, the company, not, sorry, jurisdictions like California putting more and more stringent environmental regulations into into the market, which are then copied by a number of other states, at least in the US and certainly in other markets, Scandinavia, here in Australia, Canada, et cetera, where these regulations have put a lot of pressure on companies to innovate and find new ways to reduce tailpipe emissions. So having EVs in the fleet, if you will, is a way to reduce your overall carbon. So that's
Yeah.
important too. And then I think the kind of convergence of consumer electronics and automotive has also been interesting, where sort of these technologies on the horizon and new business models have evolved too. So the Ubers of the world and the Waymos of the world sort of innovating on alternative uses of a traditional fleet. So that's one issue. And then if you look at how consumer electronics is now more and more embedded into vehicles, many cars feel a lot more like your iPhone than a traditional car. You know what I mean? So
Hmm.
in my case, I have my main driver is oh, I don't even, let's see, it's a 14-year-old Land Rover, but I've upgraded all the electronics and it feels like a new car. You know what I mean? So
Hmm.
that point of view, the rest of it's just a utility. But I think all that's really interesting and sets the table for a Tesla coming on at a time when these things are starting to converge and really sort of pushing the adoption and creating a really exciting category. You pointed out earlier with the Roadster, but the Roadster, the Model S, the X, the Model 3, sort of working up that adoption curve from, really niche early innovator to sort of early mass market was a very
Yeah.
clever strategy. And they were able to get scale and deliver the product against internal combustion engines on a cost curve that couldn't be met by a Ford or a GM or a BMW. So that really gave Tesla the in, sort of from what was it, 2008 until probably quite 2021.
Right.
And now they're starting to wobble.
But to your earlier point about, the origin of the electric vehicle, you think that, early on, that's where companies have to think about whether something is actually an invention as opposed to an innovation. When you think about an innovation, you're really thinking about, you have to also think about it from the market perspective. Is there a market for
Mm.
that particular opportunity? So I think what happened was that, to your point, the convergence of the various pieces from the technology to the consumer behaviors, the government regulatory environment created an opportunity where now this was actually an innovation that the market was ready for when Tesla
Mm.
reintroduced it.
Exactly. I think all the pieces were on the table, but those pieces didn't quite come together until these factors converged. And then maybe I should have mentioned also volatility of gasoline prices or oil plays a key role too. At some point where you're paying $5, $6 a gallon, or in our case, I think we're paying something like $2.20 per liter for traditional unleaded petrol. It's extremely attractive to start looking at alternatives. You know what I
Right,
mean? So you
right,
start thinking, okay, well, when am I going to switch?
right.
And that becomes a key factor in the mind of the consumer. So that market starts to open up.
I think one other thing we forgot to mention is just the charging infrastructure. Tesla invested in building out that charging infrastructure. That also, I think, alleviated some of the consumer anxiety around driving an electric vehicle. That also, I think, accelerated that as well.
That's right. And I think, having that infrastructure, it is interesting. Like if you go way back sort of to the Henry Ford days, how quickly Standard Oil drove that process of sort of creating this distributed mechanism for making fuel available for cars. And that happened, really over a decade. And that's largely been repeated here with EVs, which, but without the infrastructure, forget it, right? So you need
Right.
to be able to charge these things relatively quickly. And that's been the bottleneck, charging, right? So 15 minutes to 80% charge is not sufficient for a lot of consumers. And, I think we'll explore a little bit today the recent breakthrough with, Tesla's would-be competitor, BYD, coming onto the scene, sort of now kind of cracking the code on that problem and introducing sort of north of 400 kilometers of range and south of 5 minutes of recharge time, is
Right.
really a game changer. And that's where the consumer says, "Oh, well, hang on a minute, I can show up and I can put it on charge. I can go get my drink, use the toilets at the station, and come back. I'm done, ready to
Right.
go." That's something that wasn't possible before. You had to have a whole meal.
Right.
So
Right.
it's a completely different story. Now, I think it's really exciting. And so why don't we take a minute? Let's unpack the rise and what may be the fall of Tesla. Like, this is, one of our premier cases of the insurgent mindset from, the early days through really up until 3 or 4 years ago, with probably the introduction of the Cybertruck is when we first started to really get worried when that was announced. You're looking at this thing like um, it's sort of a paean to the ego of the founder, and
Right. Right.
completely going in the wrong direction. And you start to realize, hang on a minute, this masterpiece of strategy is is maybe not what it seemed.
Right. And you had that, and you had the delays in the introduction of the Model 3s, which was, really supposed to be more of the mass market sort of version of the Tesla. That was delayed too. So they had some production issues also, I think, that created an opening for other companies and also tarnished to some extent the brand a bit in terms of their production capabilities, their ability to scale.
Sure. But we have to look at the Tesla business model, right? So the way we understood it to be unfolding was very interesting. Okay, so I mentioned a little bit earlier about sort of the S curve of Tesla. So what seemed to underpin the strategy was the Roadster, which is to go after the very small market of very early stage innovator investors and consumers who wanted something cool and sexy to play with, right?
Right.
$150,000 car, absurd performance, like really cool. So that generates like a lot of excitement for the brand. Okay. Then they move into the Model S, competing against Mercedes, BMW at the
BMW.
upper end. You know what I mean? Top end Audi, European basically saloon cars. And they go again after the early adopter innovator crowd who's, wants to be seen with this Ferrari style performance in a car they can drive their kids to school in. You know what I mean? So there is a market for that. And then if you layer into that some cool features, the big screen, the kind of almost self-driving capability, the car comes to you in your driveway, whatever it is, that's pretty cool. Then the X, basically the upper echelon housewife car where they're going after, the private school crowd who wants to drive their kid around in something really sexy and cool and interesting. Same thing, all that tech embedded. So they're marching up this curve by accessing first the innovator, the early adopter,
Really adopted.
early majority, et cetera. And then when the Model 3 comes in, by then you've got all of these tech features built into a car that's it starts to be accessible to the market. And if we
Hmm.
can come back, let's look at the business model for a second. We also thought the Tesla business model was sort of a smash up of, in the early days, there was some debate about whether Tesla is actually going to be a car company, a energy company, a battery company, or an infrastructure company. And somehow it's become all
All three
four
of
of
them.
these things,
Hmm. Hmm.
but not quite any of them good enough. You know what I mean? Probably the best of what they have is the infrastructure. The car's largely been copied. The battery technology, which is at least originally was a joint venture with Panasonic, has been eclipsed. So that isn't quite up to scratch. And then there are other ventures in energy with solar and things like that have really kind of failed to reach kind of any significant scale. So not convinced about that. And then one more point before I hand it back to you, Rondo, I think is some of the innovations that Tesla brought, particularly with, for example, direct distribution. Okay,
Right.
so although they've walked back on that because now they have a lot of inventory and they need to push that into a channel. But originally, the direct distribution model was you get on the website, pay a deposit, your car is delivered, no dealerships, any of that stuff. Very, very different, right? And very
Right.
innovative. So that was pretty cool. And then subscriptions to different services to upgrade your OS on your car and things like that. So lots of innovation there in terms of how to do it differently. And largely the Fords, the GMs, the BMWs, the VWs have, that really had no flexibility to be able to adopt any of that technology. And
Right.
then my final point is during COVID, when the big chip shortage happened, Tesla was able to, because they have a full stack model or closer to a full stack model and a lot more control over their production, even though they have had problems with that. Something like 80% of their manufacturing is via robots, for example, as compared to maybe 60% for Ford. You'll have to check those figures, Rondo, but it's pretty close anyway.
Hmm. Hmm.
All these things are really different. So they come in with a different model, a very clever sort of market entry strategy. And meanwhile, they're pushing the marketing. Elon Musk is really kind of quite vocal and is driving whole countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Scandinavian countries, the European Union, Canada, to make these outrageous EV claims that basically suggests that their fleets will invert from internal combustion to EVs within 10 years in some cases, or a little bit longer for bigger scale economies, India, China, US, whatever. But I think it's really interesting the way they did it. And then came the Cybertruck, right? So I think what we expected was Tesla to go into the Model 2, which then would have been to bring a sort of 20 to 25,000 US
$1,000.
car to market to reach that next layer of the adoption curve,
Right.
the mass market, right? And but no, they introduced the Cybertruck,
Well,
which
it went to the Cybertruck, which was to compete against like the Ford F-150 pickup truck, right? So like,
yeah.
why was that the strategic choice as opposed to your point, continuing down to the the mass market? I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, you can imagine. So there's no question about it. The F-150 is one of the best-selling cars ever, okay, on the planet, but certainly in the US, has the highest margin of any car. And I think, well, it's definitely the best-selling truck, but it might be the
Yes.
best-selling vehicle. Okay. So that seems attractive. Big margins, big market, but these are petrol heads. These guys don't want to drive EVs, setting aside the design for the Cybertruck, but largely that's the transition of a company with really smart strategy, really strong insurgent mindset. Let's go after everything and let's unpick all of the elements of competition that traditional automotive manufacturers are really built on: distribution and the vehicle itself, technology, all of it, right? And then they come to this Cybertruck thing, and you can just see this is a moment of ego. I'm on
Ego.
top of the world. We're the number one electric vehicle company. I can do whatever I want. And instead of following that really deliberative strategy to keep pushing out to the next bigger market, they missed it. And you can imagine all of the attention, a completely new technology, rolled steel, all the SpaceX stuff that's built into that, whatever, really unnecessary, even if it was going to be a good competitor to the F-150. I just think it was a complete miss. And fundamentally, what happened there was they left a huge flank wide open to be exploited by another competitor that says, okay, Tesla has gone on this, has gone off on this tangent with the Cybertruck, where they should have invested those resources in updating their existing models and probably introducing the Model 2, whatever you want to call it. We'll pick it up from here, Tesla. You guys go pursue your hobby projects. Now we're going to
Right.
create mass market scale with the new product. So enter, who's next? Yeah,
BYD.
right. So
BYD.
tell us the story of BYD, Rondo.
Well, BYD is the largest seller of EVs in China. And my understanding is it controls something like 60% of the global EV registrants are sold as BYD products. So they're a big player in the market, and they focus in on the lower end of the market, the mass market. And what's really interesting about BYD is it's vertically integrated in terms of its supply chain. So 70% of, the major components of that car are made in-house, including, the battery. They have, they get the minerals to make the battery, the lithium, the cobalt, et cetera,
The
in-house.
chips.
The chips. Yeah, some of the motors for the vehicle are made in-house. So that gives them a lot of control over their production, as well as it allows them to stay competitive in terms of their pricing by doing that. So they can scale very quickly.
Yeah, and that vertical integration is pretty significant. So it goes as far um, upstream as raw materials, as you pointed earlier, but even downstream in terms of shipping. So shipping containers and ships. So
Mm,
that is a pretty significant sort of shift. It feels very old economy, but you're right, the ability to um, well, fundamentally, there's really one thing, right? Is they've created the ability to scale.
yeah.
Okay. And so, Rhonda, what were the origins of BYD? So where did they come from? Because it felt like here in Australia, we have BYD where it's been introduced and these cars just started showing up, right?
Yeah.
And no one was talking about it. Next thing you know, you see a build your dreams car. And you're like, oh, that's really interesting. And of course, it's Chinese built, right?
Right.
But I know you don't have them here, but they're
We don't have
pretty
them in
slick.
we don't have them in the US, right?
They're pretty
Right.
slick cars, right? And you're looking at these things like it kind of reminds me of like Kia, where
Right.
or Hyundai, where these cars came onto the market, and the first generation seemed a bit shoddy. The second generation, wow, these really look okay. And by the time you get to the third generation, you're virtually the same as a Toyota, right? So the
Hmm.
build quality and everything else is like, wow, but the generations are so short, right? It's like a 3-year
Right.
cycle or even a 2-year
A
cycle.
2-year cycle, from what I understand.
Exactly, instead of a
Yeah.
5-year cycle, right? And you're looking at these things like, holy cow, this is something that even though this first version might not be great, in 2 years I'm going to get another one, and in 4 years I'm going to get something that's virtually indistinguishable from a Tesla and probably better.
But isn't that the typical way that disruption, a technology disruption happens in an industry? You sort of start at the lower end of the market with a product or solution that may not be of the same quality as the incumbent, but you get traction and you continue to improve and iterate on that product until you become before when the incumbent looks up, you're like at the same level of quality, if not better than them, and you've disrupted the market. And so it feels like that's what's happened
Sure.
here.
Yeah, it's the classic fast follower sort of
Right.
approach. But if we go back in time a little bit, you start doing some research on BYD, you'll discover that BYD was a battery company first. Okay, so BYD was a pioneer in battery tech. I think they were number two in China, and really focused on battery innovation and particularly battery scale. Okay, so BYD partnered up with a whole bunch of different um, people around the world to bring their battery technology to market. The Koreans, Japanese, obviously very strong in China, but
Right.
as an OEM for battery technology out to the world in consumer electronics and industrial applications and everything, right? So already has scale in batteries, okay, pre-EV launch. And that scale is big and quite significant. Then you have this situation where um, BYD decides to enter the market. And cleverly, they don't first go after the Tesla segment. They build scale primarily in buses and taxis in the first instance, particularly in China. Their first model was a taxi, and creating a utility vehicle for taxi drivers through a joint venture or partnership, at least with Toyota, bringing in some of their technology. And that enabled them to reach manufacturing scale really quickly in China. So now they're generating 100,000 units or whatever it is in China. They worked out their production. They're selling buses. BYD is a very strong provider, and BYD technology is in American buses. Okay, so you might not know that, but
Mhm.
they're reaching this scale, and then Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway make a huge investment, some 300 million, something like that, into BYD. Maybe it was 2020. Okay, and BYD starts eyeing this segment that we're talking about, which is this sort of, at least in China, let's call it a $10,000 to $20,000 EV for the mass market. And they've already got scale. They've got the battery
Got the
technology.
batteries.
Tesla's already built the infrastructure, right? So that's already there. They have these pivotal partnerships, Berkshire Hathaway, Toyota, Hyundai. They have distribution because of the scale that they've already built. They're well positioned to build this vertically integrated strategy, right? And now all they need are models, right? And so this sort of ability to demonstrate scale is like a capital magnet. And so then, of course, they're able to start introducing these new models at a pace that Tesla just doesn't, even with its $1 trillion+ valuation, just doesn't have the resources to kind of start cranking out these new models. I think that BYD has created, I counted them up, and I might not get this correct. In the last 4 years, there's been 12 or 13 new consumer automobile models against how many for Tesla? Cybertruck, Model Y,
Model
Model
Y.
Y upgrade, and Model 3 is now pretty long in the tooth, so I wouldn't even count that one. So it's 13 versus 3. How do you keep up with that innovation? Tesla's fallen way behind on that. Meanwhile, of course, the big auto hasn't stood still either. Virtually
No.
everyone's got an EV lineup. So yeah,
And then you have, EV companies like Rivian and Lucid in the US. They've carved out parts of the market for themselves as well, and they're eating into EV sales in the US as well.
a little bit. The Rivians of the world aren't even in the top 20 in the world, right? So these are niche cars that have
And
come
so as I
out.
say, they are niche cars.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. I'm pretty sure BMW is number 3 in the world now, after
Yes.
BYD being number 1, which is roughly at 2 times the volume of Tesla. And then, let's call it, again, you'd have to check my numbers, but I think Tesla then is 4 times the volume of BMW. And then there's a long tail of sort of 300,000 to 400,000 units, particularly European cars, but Toyota, BMW, VW, and a number of different Chinese players operating in that sort of 300,000 to 500,000 unit range. So there is a
Hmm.
big long tail, and it's unclear, who will sort of emerge, or maybe the whole market shifts. But I think BYD roughly has, let's call it a little bit more, maybe 12 or 13% of a 20 million unit market for 2025. And
Yeah.
Tesla is maybe 4 to 5% and declining as
Yeah.
as a percentage of the
As
market, right?
Yeah, and a lot of the decline, I mean, I shouldn't say a lot. Some of the decline is not only because of the intense competition from BYD, but also because of some of the actions of, Elon Musk, in terms of the U.S. political election last year and his involvement with the Trump administration. That's created backlash for him and for the Tesla organization, not only in the US, but also in Europe. So some of the decline in Tesla sales is due to that as well.
Right. Tesla's not in a great position. and you can see the market's punishing him for it. But if you hold Tesla stock, maybe think about these 3 or 4 things. Okay, so one is the automotive market is global; it's not just America. Okay, and Tesla's market is being increasingly protected by tariffs in the U.S. And if those tariffs ebb or fall away, and these Chinese companies, particularly BYD, can challenge Tesla in the US market, it's going to be devastating for Tesla,
Right.
right? So, Rondo, I've seen these cars. They are really beautiful,
Yeah, I just
excellent
looked
vehicles,
online. I mean, they're
right?
gorgeous cars.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, so there's a lot of tech in these cars. So that's one. Two is you just don't see the evidence of Tesla keeping pace with the innovation. I'm not introducing new models. They're not, they're sort of adrift. And then three, your point, and tied back to my first point, you have countries like Germany where their Tesla volume has cratered by 70, 80, 90%.
Yes. Europe
Canada,
is
Germany,
50%.
most of Europe is north of 50%. China, it's completely cratered. And in the US, the heart market of largely blue state Democrats, if I can use that language, or the environmentally conscious, which tend to skew that way, are increasingly leaving the brand. And I don't think the red state Republican gas guzzling sort of market is going to pick up the slack fast enough.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say Tesla's probably in terminal decline at this point.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, when you look at the aftermarket here for Tesla in the US, I understand that, people can expect to lose 25 to 30% of the value of their car in the aftermarket. And people are actively trying to sell their Teslas here, but
hmm,
they're taking a loss,
yeah,
returning their cars, vandalizing their cars. There was a story in the paper the other day. This artist, this R&B artist, Erica Badu, neo soul artist, I would say, she apparently vandalized her own Tesla, as she said, to be on trend.
right.
So, yeah, it's this
Anything for views, right?
right.
But
Anything for views.
that's really unproductive. But setting all that aside, right? Tesla certainly was one of the great disruption stories of our age, and certainly for, you know, I don't know, 9/10 or 8/10 of their history, one of the great insurgent mindset companies
Yeah,
ever.
yeah,
Now, if you're a shareholder of Tesla, you got your pitchfork and you've got your your torch, and you're saying, I want a new CEO. Give me somebody that can turn this thing around and bring it around. Because there is still brand equity there and there's still value there, but it's hard to see how they move out of this corner. One more thing. Okay, so the Tesla versus BYD is an interesting story on all these other dimensions, but becomes so much more interesting when you look at the margin or the marginal cost per vehicle. Okay, so just in the third or fourth quarter of 2024, these two have crossed over where BYD is generating more profit for per vehicle than
right.
Tesla is, even at these relatively low costs. I mean, we're talking 10, 12,000 US dollars in China for these cars. Okay. And they're making money on those. Okay. It comes back to vertical integration, all the things you talked about earlier, right? But
Hmm.
Tesla is not even recovering cost of goods sold on their vehicles now. Okay. So that's a problem that, is only going to widen as this lower cost as the market gets exposed to this lower cost competition.
Right.
So
And do you think part of that too is because, as a Chinese manufacturer, the Chinese are known for, being low cost producers, right? That's like a competency, a capability that they have. Was that something that just was naturally to BYD's advantage, do you think?
I think we have to look at why is it low cost. Okay, so it's vertical integration to your point. Okay, and it's just the mind-boggling scale of this thing, right? Manufacturing it for these types of products is really about scale, right?
Right.
They're high capital, high fixed costs, but the unit cost goes down as volume increases. And, from that point of view, now that they've got this scale, they can punch these things out, virtually, almost, let's call it a third the price of a BMW
Right.
electric vehicle.
Right.
If you're a BMW aficionado, you're probably upper middle class or middle class, and you have the resources to buy that car. You're probably still going to buy the BMW, but you're looking at this BYD car, which has all this cool tech, has a really good build quality, and it's got to be pretty tempting. It's particularly with 400 or 500 kilometer range and 5 minute recharging. I think it's interesting. Now, the thing that we know from studying all these cases over all these years, Rondo, is that BYD might completely crater and we might have someone else new next month. But,
Right.
I think the one thing that strikes me about BYD is we're not hearing about the leader, right? We're not hearing about BYD's CEO. I can't even name him or her. I don't even know who it is,
Right.
right? But this is a company that's doing company things that's very clever in terms of how it's exploited the market. And, I would say there's a collective insurgent mindset at a company like BYD, or they wouldn't be able to innovate at this pace. They wouldn't be able to crunch they wouldn't be able to crunch the new car cycle time down to 2 years from what's typically a 4 year cycle. They just wouldn't be able to do it. So you can imagine a very decentralized approach to centralized in a sense of the big system, but decentralized in the approach to innovation. It almost has to be that way to be able to reach this scale and this level of distribution, this level of innovation at this pace.
But I'm wondering though, coming back to my point, is if culturally the Chinese companies tend to have a cost advantage in terms of their mindset. Like they're always thinking about how can they be low cost, the lowest cost producer. And so having that capability as a core sort of cultural capability sort of help them, I think, get to where they are.
I'd like to explore that in a future episode because it's a very interesting question. I don't believe that's the case. I think China is graduating from that perception. You have companies like Hire, which you know very well,
Yeah.
which are not competing on cost. These companies are competing on differentiation and technology. And I think that sort of old idea that China is a fast follower, low cost producer. I think we're moving into a new age. In any case, we do need to wrap it up, Rondo. It's been great talking about EVs with you, and I look forward to exploring that issue in our next or following episodes.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it.
All right, I'm Matt Tice from the Insurgent Mindset.